Kennington, across the river from Westminster. Yes, I'm south of the river. An area famous for the Imperial War Museum, the Oval Cricket Ground, and Charlie Chaplin. But does it have any nice historic pubs? That's what I'm here to find out. The first of today's tour is the Three Stags. Cheers from the Three Stags. This pub sits on the crossroads between Kennington Road and Lambeth Road. It's probably open to debate whether this should be called Kennington at this point rather than Lambeth. I'll leave that to the estate agents among you to decide. The current building dates to 1891. You can see that picked out in an ironwork grille. Lots of familiar tropes of late Victorian pub architecture here. The run of pillars along the ground floor frontage, similar capitals in the joms, I think these are called, either side of the windows, and somewhat Palladian in style, I would say, those windows on the first floor. Pediments over the two main entrances, arched windows on the ground floor, and one or two of those have stained glass in the upper lights. The pub dates to the 18th century, and the earliest newspaper mention I could find for it is from 1790. I suspect it's not significantly older than that. In the first half of the 18th century, this was something of a backwater with lots of open fields surrounding this site, as you can see on John Rock's map of 1746. Although there is a building on roughly this site, it wasn't really until the completion of Westminster Bridge in 1750 that the area started to grow. That said, there was another pub very close to here that was marked on the map at that time, the Dog and Duck, and we'll come back to that a bit later. Wind forward to the late Victorian period, and Charlie Chaplin, born in 1889, spent his early life living in the Kennington area. His parents were both music hall entertainers, and at that time Kennington was a popular place for people in that business to live. Many of the local pubs would have drawn much of their trade from both the entertainers and their fans. There was a custom at the time for music hall entertainers to encourage members of the audience to go back to the pub with them after the show, sometimes even beforehand, and they would get kickbacks from the drink sales therein. Quite often that formed a significant part of their income. This may have been a contributing factor to Charlie Chaplin's father, also a Charles Chaplin, dying at the very young age of 39. From dropsy, or edema as we might call it today, this pub was famously the last place that Charlie Chaplin saw his father alive. There is a Chaplin's Corner of the pub, and supposedly that is the spot within the pub where that last meeting occurred. Today it is a somewhat more food-leaning pub, I get the sense. Here is a lineup of what they had on the bar. I went for a half of Abbott, a little bit strong for the first drink of the day at 5%, and a little bit rich and malty. This feels more like a winter beer than one for a very hot day as it is today. On part of the site now occupied by the Imperial War Museum here in Kennington is a now long since gone pub called the Dog and Duck. It was obviously considered quite a significant landmark in its day because, as noted earlier on John Rock's map of 1746, you can see it named. It sat in St George's Fields and was a one-time venue for the sport, if you can call it that, of duck baiting. This involved a pinioned duck so that it couldn't fly, being submerged into a pond and then chased by a pack of dogs. You can see the ponds on the map where this would have taken place. It went into a state of further moral decline, having not started on particularly high ground, and by 1799 its licence was withdrawn. Nearly a century later though, it was still being remembered on the 1890s Ordnance Survey map. At that time, prior to the building of the Imperial War Museum here, the site was occupied by the Bethlehem Royal Hospital, more commonly known as Bedlam. This famous lunatic asylum was relocated several times over the centuries, having previously been on a site at Moorfields, and today the buildings can be found in Bromley. Another closed pub, and sadly quite a recent one. I think it was the end of 2023 or maybe early 2024 when it closed. The Tankard here, the building does at least still stand, so perhaps there is a chance this might at some point reopen. It was probably first established in the early 1800s. In fact, on the side of the pub there it said it was established in 1825. I could well believe that. It first starts to appear in newspapers in the 1830s, including this account from 1838 of a duel between two gentlemen in which one of them was fatally shot. The duel was just to settle a bet for £100. One witness had remarked on the folly of deciding a wager in such a way. That's putting it rather lightly, I think. The pub was rebuilt in 1879, and here is a photo of it taken shortly after that in 1880. So it looks like there is actually some building work going on at the moment, and a bit of good news from chatting to one of the builders just now is that the pub is actually due to reopen at the end of July. Always good to see a pub coming back to life. The ship here apparently was first established in the 1780s and was rebuilt in the 1840s. That's all I seem to have written about it in my notes. A relatively rare example of an early Victorian pub building then. Most of them seem to have been rebuilt in the late Victorian era, that great pub building boom. I'm not going to go into this one. I've got a lot of pubs on the list today, and I think if I recall correctly there wasn't any real ale here, so skip this one, but nice to see, as I say, an early Victorian pub building. Next, here on Black Prince Road, we have the Black Prince. Cheers from the Black Prince. It's a 1920s building. I suppose, roughly speaking, it's in the Neo-Georgian style, but I was a little bit thrown by those gables at the top. Also, this double-height oriel window. You don't often see those on these interwar Neo-Georgian pub buildings. The ground floor is tiled, and today in a slightly dour colour scheme. Perhaps that's in keeping with how it might have looked in the original 1920s colouring. There is a nice panel there with a swag beneath which is the slogan "Fine Ales and Stout," and I think that is original from the 1920s, but those BP initials have been added more recently, BP for the Black Prince. Inside there is wood panelling as far as the eye can see, and I think much of that is original from the 1920s. It's certainly in a style which could be. That barback advertising sign for Double Diamond is likely 1960s, and we've seen very similar examples of those at places like the Coach and Horses in Greek Street in Soho. The name then, the Black Prince, is a reference to Prince Edward in the 14th century, who would have become King Edward IV had he not predeceased his father, Edward III. The pub is located on Black Prince Road, suggesting that the pub may have taken its name from the road, but in fact I think it may actually be the other way round, sort of. A few pubs dotted around London are named after Prince Edward, the Black Prince, but it's particularly relevant here because this is on the site of his London residence, Kennington Palace. Where the Black Prince pub sits is possibly just at the northern edge of where that estate would have been. It looks like the pub, prior to this rebuild, has at least 18th century origins, and here is a newspaper mention of it from 1797. You can see the locations mentioned in that advert a couple of years later in Hallward's map of 1799, so presumably the Black Prince pub would have been one of these buildings around here. At that time the road isn't called Black Prince Road, just called Prince's Road, albeit it's a much shorter section than it is today. At the time of the 1890s OS map, this was still called Prince's Road, but you can see a Black Prince yard behind the pub. But by the mid-1900s OS map, the road has become Black Prince Road. Apparently the renaming was sometime in the 1930s. It's interesting that it's the pub which kept the name Black Prince alive for much of that time. So in a sense today the road is really named after the pub. In more recent history, the exterior was used as a filming location for Kingsman. Possibly they used the interior as well. They must have re-draped it somewhat because it looks a bit different in the film. This is of course the scene wherein Colin Firth's character savagely assaults an innocent mob of thugs with his umbrella. I was very happy to find Harvey's Sussex Best on the hand pumps. Both hand pumps that were currently serving were serving this, no complaints from me. So that's what I've gone for, and that's in pretty good shape actually, nice and cool on a hot day like today. Cheers. Next up, further along Black Prince Road, we have the Jolly Gardeners. Just a brief note on this pub, the Jolly Gardeners, because I happen to note it gets a mention in Mark Girouard's excellent book, Victorian Pubs. Frederick Callcott, an artist who we've encountered a few times before in these videos, sculpted the panel at the corner over the door there, which depicts two gardeners, presumably both of them jolly. One is holding a spade, the other is holding a scythe. And I think it would be fair to say that there's a little bit of the arts and crafts about it, as there was with much of Frederick Callcott's work. It certainly depicts good, honest toil. Callcott is perhaps more famous for his metalwork, including the copper panels to be found in the Black Lion in Kilburn, some of the panels inside the Blackfriar at Blackfriars, and also, I think, the Prince Edward in Holloway, the copper panel tunnels there, although they're not officially attributed to him. The Jolly Gardeners here was rebuilt in the 1880s. For a while this pub was known as Zeitgeist, and I think I came here a couple of times during that era. I had a colleague at the time who was particularly into their currywurst. They served German beers and German food. It has now reverted to the original name, the Jolly Gardeners, which is presumably a testament to the fact that at one time there were many fields and gardens around here, and you can see an example of that on Hallward's map of 1799. The pub may in fact go all the way back to the 1790s, so could well have been in existence at that point in time. Here is a newspaper account of it from 1792. Today I get the feeling it's veering a little bit gastro, so I think I'm going to skip going in this one. Plenty more pubs still to see. I have to admit I'm really taken with the housing stock, the building stock in Kennington. Some lovely buildings lining Kennington Road as I've been walking down between these pubs, and here at the corner of Black Prince Road and Kennington Road has to be what I think is the single most attractive Tesco Express in the country. Look at that beautiful round stock brick turret there. I mean, whether or not that's improved by the circular Tesco Express sign, I don't know, but I suppose it is at least in keeping with it topologically, if that's the right word. Next up, we have the Doghouse, formerly known as the Roebuck. Cheers from the Doghouse, formerly the Roebuck. Apparently the current building dates to 1877. I think you can see that date in the corbels at the corner, particularly the one on the top floor there. And I suppose it does show that slightly more restrained pub architecture style from the mid-Victorian period before it gave way to the flamboyant excesses of late Victorian pub architecture. There's some modest stucco dressing for the window arches in an arcade along the first floor, including a couple of blind windows interspersed with these roundels. I suspect the ground floor frontage was tarted up a bit in the 1890s, as it has a familiar run of pink granite pilasters, possibly Swedish coastal granite, and that was a style that only really came in towards the end of the Victorian era. Those pillars are topped with an interesting mixture of Corinthian gilded capitals with other heads in them, including one that looks a little bit like Beelzebub. Inside, I suppose you could describe this today as a sort of eclectic, quirky sort of an interior. Not sure that there is a huge amount of original fabric. There is at least one column behind the bar, which I assume dates to the Victorian era, but elsewhere most of the decorations are more modern, stuffed animal heads, taxidermy, that sort of thing. Here is a quick look at what was on the bar lineup. Quite a few hand pumps there, I think just 3 of them currently in service. 2 of those look very much like the sort of pale ales I tend to avoid, but they did have good old stalwart London pride, so that's what I went for, half of that. Nice to see it in one of those glasses with a handle on. Another pub which deserves a mention, even though it's gone a bit gastro on the inside, is what is now known as the Tommyfield. It does still have an attractive Victorian pub exterior. The old name of the pub is also still displayed on a gable at the top of the building, the White Hart. Round this side of the pub you can also see a plaque with what I believe to be the landlord at the time it was last rebuilt, Alexander James Avery, in 1897. The pub goes back at least 100 years prior to that. Unusually, it is marked, named on the 1799 map by Hallward, suggesting it was probably considered to be a significant landmark. So like I said, it does look a little bit too gastro to me, so I won't bother going inside that one today. But it does lead us nicely into Cleaver Square, wherein one of Kennington's most famous hidden gems is to be found, which sadly seems to be closed. It's the middle of Friday afternoon. I don't know if it just does very old-fashioned lunchtime hours and then evening hours, but it's all shut up. It looks like it doesn't open until 3 p.m. on a Friday. It's now just gone 2 p.m. I checked that for all of the other pubs, but for some reason I didn't think to look for this particular one, so I'll have to come back a bit later, I suppose. Next, over there, we have the Old Red Lion. Cheers from the Old Red Lion. It is a nice bit of interwar mock Tudor, and it's a listed building. Built in 1933, the architect was Sidney Charles Clark, whose work we've seen a few times before in these videos. He designed many of the pubs built in this style for Charrington's Brewery. This example is half timbered, otherwise constructed in brick. There's a central gable with a carved band running across, and at either end of that are these carved Red Lion brackets. The ground floor has a total of 3 entrances and 2 runs of windows, I think 5 bays each, and all of those windows and entrances have Tudor arches. Beneath the windows, for the infill between the beams, is what I believe is called brick nogging. What a charming term that is. The smaller building to the left as you're facing it was originally an off-licence and was built at the same time, connected to the pub. Inside, the pub is on camera's list of historic interiors, and they say prior to some modifications in 2010, this was actually the best preserved, most intact interwar mock Tudor pub in the entire country. Those alterations were mainly towards the rear of the pub, and so the front sections are still almost entirely as they were in the 1930s. It retains the public bar and saloon bar split right down the middle of the pub. There's no signage to show you which is which. Possibly that central entrance leads to the public bar and the left entrance leads to the saloon bar. I think I may have got that wrong. There are stained glass windows at the front, which as always can be best appreciated from the inside. Lovely coloured panes there, and also in various spaces in the internal partitions inside the pub, including one here showing the Toby Jug logo of Charrington's. The beams, very present throughout much of the interior, have been adzed, A-D-Z-E-D, it's kind of axe used in woodworking, particularly in barrel making as well, and the intention of this adzing of those beams is to give them a more sort of rustic and possibly antique feel. Both sides have similar style bar counters. The camera's notes believe them both to be original. They contain matchboard panelling, but slightly unusually some of that matchboard panelling is horizontal rather than the usual vertical arrangement we're familiar with seeing. The bar back, I believe on both sides in fact, is in a similar style and has a Tudor arch in it with some really nice carving depicting bunches of grapes, and several of the fireplaces have these spiral brick columns, apparently a motif, a trademark if you will, of Sidney Clark. You can see that in several of his pubs. Those alterations of 2010, as noted, were mostly towards the back. They added an open plan kitchen and also converted the former toilets into 2 alcove seating areas. Interestingly, they kept the original tiling from the toilets. So, slightly strange space to sit in today. I have to admit I didn't really do my research for the history of this pub, sort of ran out of time before I came today. But the Historic England listing suggests that the prior pub building before that 1930s rebuild went all the way back to 1750, so there has been a pub on this site called the Red Lion, justifiably the old Red Lion I suppose today, going back at least 270 something years. 3 hand pumps on the bar in total, 1 for cider. I think it might be, is it a Portobello Brewery pub today? I've gone for a half of their Star Bitter, which is all right actually for a modern, probably slightly craft-leaning brewery. I should add, very nice garden out the back, which is where I'm sitting now, with a sheltered bit over to one side with a lovely run of wisteria. Very pleasant. Next up, the King's Arms. I actually did no research whatsoever. I really have not done my homework on this pub, but I have a little bit of time to kill before the Prince of Wales opens. And it is a really handsome building, isn't it? Look at that lovely curved corner with that. Is that sort of a mansard roof? Perhaps not. Interesting shaped roof to that. Don't know anything about it, as I say. I may attempt to Google some basic facts. Cheers from the King's Arms. There's no real ale here, so I've just gone for a half of Guinness. That's in pretty good shape as Guinness goes. Apparently this is an interwar pub. An unusual style. Does that come under the category of Neo-Georgian? As I often say, you only get 2 styles in those interwar pub buildings, either Neo-Georgian or mock Tudor. This is the second example down here in Kennington where they seem to be bending those rules a little bit. The rebuild was something like 1938 or 1939, so just on the eve of the Second World War. One of the latest interwar pubs I suppose we've seen. Anything later than that, it wouldn't be interwar anymore, would it? There has, however, apparently been a pub on this site with this name going all the way back to around 1800. It was a little bit difficult to get interior shots without disturbing the locals, so just a couple of brief glimpses here. But it's interesting interior. Everything, of course, is curved. The whole building is curved, so much of the interior is by necessity also curved. What I was going to say, nice big sprawling beer garden as well. Let's try this again then. It is 3 o'clock now. It seems to be open. The Prince of Wales on Cleaver Square. Cheers from the Prince of Wales. This is a pub I've actually been to a few times before, unlike many of the others we're seeing today in Kennington. It's often referred to as a hidden gem, and I think that is partly down to its location here, tucked in a corner of Cleaver Square, which was in fact South London's first garden square, laid out in 1789. It's perhaps best known today for the petanque court in the middle, and you can take your beer, if you get it in a plastic glass, out and sit in the square there and play petanque while you're having a pint. The current building is actually in a different style from the rest of the, I think, predominantly Georgian buildings on Cleaver Square, and yet somehow it manages to blend in. A plaque on the front tells us it dates to 1901 in that triangular pediment there. Relatively modest flat brick arches across the windows on the first floor, perhaps an attempt to blend in with its Georgian neighbours, but slightly more lavish dressings to the windows on the second floor, these somewhat elaborate arches. On the ground floor, it's kept fairly simple, two entrances either side of the building with a slightly bowed window in between them, small square panes of glass, and some of those are crown glass. Inside, I'm not sure if much of the fabric dates to that rebuild of 1901. The bar counter at least looks relatively old, and a few other interesting curios here and there. It seems quite likely the pub goes as far back as Cleaver Square itself, as I said, first laid out in 1789. The earliest written reference I found to the pub is in 1806, at which time Cleaver Square was called Prince's Square. Looking at Hallward's map of 1799, not long after Cleaver Square was first laid out, I suspect the naming of it at that time, Prince's Square, follows that of Prince's Road and Prince's Place nearby, which we saw earlier when we were talking about the Black Prince. So the original name of this square, Prince's Square, may also be a reference to the Black Prince, who, as we said earlier, had his London estate, Kennington Palace, here in the 14th century. He, of course, would also be a Prince of Wales, a tradition that was started by his great-grandfather, Edward I. At the time the pub was first established, likely 1789, but no later than 1806, the Prince of Wales at the time would be he who later became George IV and was also the Prince Regent for a while. And it's that prince, that later king, that we see depicted on the sign today, which I think is quite fitting in this case. The picture on the sign is adapted from this portrait of 1798 by Sir William Beechey, so it's somewhat contemporary with the pub and with Cleaver Square. It's a Shepherd Neame pub today. I think it has been for quite a long time, at least as long as I've known it. Alas, on this particular visit, the usual stalwarts of Shepherd Neame, like Master Brew and Spitfire, were not available. Just 3 hand pumps, the Spitfire was off. The 2 flanking it either side, very much pale ales, which did not seem to be things that I would get on with, not to my taste, so I've just gone for a half of Guinness again. Final pub of today's tour. You could probably argue this is more Vauxhall than Kennington, but I'm not sure when else I would cover it. This pub today is called MC and Sons, but originally this was the Royal Oak. Cheers from MC and Sons, formerly the Royal Oak. Something like 2023 it changed from the Royal Oak to MC and Sons, but that former name, the Royal Oak, goes all the way back to at least the 18th century. Just a single story for the main pub area, and I think it's quite cute with that pediment at the corner there, surrounded by a balustrade either side. It has a slight feeling of a tiara or something atop the pub frontage, and above that projecting ground floor frontage there is today a roof garden. I'm not sure if that's accessible today. In its former incarnation as the Royal Oak, it had a red and white colour scheme on the exterior. Today it's a slightly severe looking green, but perhaps that's more consistent with how it would have looked in the late Victorian period. Part of that pediment on the corner of the frontage there tells us that it was rebuilt in 1891, and below that there is also an intriguing sign with the words brewery tap. We'll come back to that later. A nice broken pediment over the main entrance here, and it seems there's mostly just a single entrance. I suppose there is one down by the side. Beneath one of the windows you can still see the old name of the pub, the Royal Oak, and there's also some signage from, I believe, the 1920s, at which point it was a Bass pub, advertising Bass on draft. Alas, that is likely to lead to disappointment today. It doesn't seem they serve any real ale in its current incarnation. The pub is, however, on CAMRA's list of historic historic pub interiors. Cameras notes say that it originally would have had internal divisions, which is slightly surprising as it seems to only really have that one main entrance, other than that side entrance I was just talking about. Cameras notes say that the bar counter with its matchboard panelling and its simple brackets looks to be original. The bar back, quite possibly also original from the 1890s. They also note the seating, even though they don't think that's original from the late Victorian period, quite possibly 1920s when Bass took over. There is some nice stained glass in the upper lights of some of those external windows, and there is a nice snug on the left-hand side as you first enter, but that is apparently a more modern addition. As noted, it seems the pub likely goes back to at least the mid 18th century, and the earliest newspaper mention I could find for it is from 1759. I am quite intrigued by that writing on the pub frontage there, bearing the words Brewery Tap. According to the Brewery History website, it was formerly a Wenlock Brewery pub. We of course know where the Brewery Tap for the Wenlock Brewery is. It was the Wenlock Arms in Hoxton, so it can't have been the Brewery Tap for the Wenlock Brewery. However, if we take a look at the 1890s Ordnance Survey map, we can see just around the corner on Durham Street there was a brewery there at that time. Interestingly, the pub itself is not marked with the usual PH at that time, but I suppose that's probably because it was a beer house somewhere with a beer only license. I believe that brewery was the New London Brewery. Thanks to the excellent Brewery History website, we have some information about that, and surprisingly some of the old brewery buildings still exist today just around the corner from the pub. Today, as noted, it's all keg taps, so I've just gone for another half of Guinness. I think that's going to be it then, here from the very public urinals at Vauxhall. What a classy place this is. Obviously no longer in Kennington anymore, definitely in Vauxhall here. I think Kennington's actually been quite a nice surprise. The beer, as always, has been a bit variable. That's just London in the 21st century, I'm afraid. But the pubs, I think there have been some particular gems there. Really like the Black Prince. And you already like the Prince of Wales, no surprises there. And a couple of others that I think are pretty decent as well. So I hope that's been of some interest, some entertainment value. I'm dying of heat exhaustion. I'm going to go home and have an ice bath or something. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.